CheckIron has been live since June 2019, and as of the 1st of August 2020, we've had 290 people upload their raw DNA data so we can analyse it. That's in 14 months. And I really want to say to everyone a sincere thank you. Your data has made a massive contribution to our understanding of hemochromatosis, and this video is going to tell you about those findings. There are quite a few surprises, and a number of these contradict the hemochromatosis experts. So, to those watching this video, this is your data and I am showing you your results. So why would we be different from the experts? The reason is the experts have never looked at such large data sets with diverse DNA data. A medical DNA test usually just looks at one or two genes, whereas we're using a commercial data set with thousands of gene results. So let's look at CheckIron's data. First thing to say is that the data is not representative of the general population. The people sending us data are from Facebook hemochromatosis groups. Most people in these data sets have hemochromatosis. So let's look at CheckIron's data. First thing to say is that the data is not representative of the general population. The people sending us data are from the Facebook hemochromatosis groups. Most people in these data sets have hemochromatosis, whereas the experts would say that 1 in 200 of the general population have hemochromatosis. We also dispute that number, but more of that later. As you can see from this picture, 26% of DNA datasets did not report hemochromatosis, whereas 60% were hemochromatosis type 1, that's the common one, and 9% type 1 and 3, and 3% just type 3. As for the 26% not having hemochromatosis, we welcome people submitting data without hemochromatosis. This is because our goal is prevention of iron overload, and we want everyone in the world to submit their data to us. Even if someone does not have hemochromatosis, we will still report inflammatory risks, and over time, as we get more data, we may be able to give some prediction of inflammatory disease risks, and will also predict an age at symptoms. But for now, we only provide the age at symptoms estimate prediction for the hemochromatosis detected people. So it was surprising that there were so many type 3, because we thought that was a rare condition, and it appears it's not rare at all. Also, we had no one with type 2, which is called juvenile hemochromatosis, or type 4, also called ferroportin disease. If you do searches for the prevalence of type 2 and type 4, you won't find any numbers, although when someone reports getting hemochromatosis at a young age, I often see comments that the person has juvenile hemochromatosis. It seems more likely that they are homozygous C282Y with modifiers for fast loading, as we'll show in a minute. The next pie chart shows which DNA suppliers are used. Ancestry is the most popular, and 23andMe is in second place. Ancestry performs the best for hemochromatosis because it covers all 3 mutations, including S65C, which 23andMe does not support, and Ancestry supports more of the hemochromatosis type 3 mutations. This table shows the coverage for the various suppliers with hemochromatosis types, and then further down the table with other inflammatory conditions. Note that Ancestry is not only better at supporting the S65C HFE mutation, but is also much better with hemochromatosis type 2, 3 and 4. The pie chart shows the relative proportion we got for CheckIron uploaders. Note, this does not represent the world's population. For those Facebook hemochromatosis group people that uploaded their data, we can see there are more carriers than anything else, and that H63D carriers dominate. After carriers, it's hemochromatosis 282Y people who come in at 19%. Then compound C282Y H63D, and then homozygous H63D. Note, in general, most of these people are hemochromatosis sufferers. That's why they're uploading their data. But in the long term, we hope that CheckIron will be used more for risk assessment and then prevention of iron overload when deemed necessary. At CheckIron, we believe DNA alone can be used to define someone's risk of iron overload, despite most of the experts saying that this is not possible. Clearly, iron panel blood tests can be used, but once you have raised blood iron levels, it means some damage has already been done. So I'm very keen on taking the step of saying identify risks and estimate from the DNA the age of symptoms, and then proactively prevent iron overload before you get raised iron levels and therefore get damage. So why do I disagree with the experts? Well, it's simply that the medical experts mistakenly believe that hemochromatosis is due to a single HFE gene and nothing else. Let's quickly listen to an expert called Dr. Paul Adams about this.
The most powerful thing that came out of the discovery of the gene immediately was the ability to diagnose hemochromatosis quickly, particularly within families. The typical hemochromatosis patient, they almost all have exactly the same genetic mutation. And that's not true with most genetic diseases. If you took like cystic fibrosis, there are hundreds of different genetic mutations that are close in the same region, but they're not exactly the same. But in hemochromatosis, most people have exactly the same genetic mutation. So that means when you're developing a genetic test, you only have to zero in on one little spot.
The point he makes is most genetic diseases are caused by hundreds of mutations of genes. He thinks it unusual that hemochromatosis is caused by the mutation of a single gene, the HFE gene. The problem is he's wrong. It's caused by hundreds of mutations of lots of genes, as he says is common for other diseases. And this is confirmed by all the scientific papers on the subject. Note, it is the mutation of the HFE gene that turns on type 1 hemochromatosis, but then it's hundreds of other genes which governs the speed of iron overloading, and therefore the other genes determine whether you suffer from it or not before you die from old age. The problem is too many doctors and the hemochromatosis organisations, such as the Canadian and UK ones, seem to have this incorrect view that no one in the scientific community agrees with. And at CheckIron we also see in the data that relying on just the HFE gene is absolutely not true. This false information has also permeated to the defining of the doctor's procedures for diagnosing hemochromatosis. Because they only look at one gene, they cannot tell if any one person will get it during their lifetime just by looking at the HFE gene mutations. This is true, but if you look at the other genes involved, you can predict as a standard deviation within 8 to 10 years when someone might get hemochromatosis, and that's independent of lifestyle factors like what you're eating or whether you're a man or a woman. Let's look at the CheckIron data for the people who upload their DNA data. Again, this is not representative of the general population, as most of these people who uploaded their data were actual hemochromatosis sufferers. This is especially true of carriers, since in the general population, between 98 and 99% of carriers do not suffer iron overload at all, but in these graphs most do. This is because they have self-selected. This graph shows that the predicted age at symptoms for the 290 people who have uploaded their raw DNA to CheckIron. It shows you age ranges of being at risk for the different HFE mutation types, as well as for hemochromatosis type 3. Note, if it predicts an age of symptoms greater than about 80 years old, then you are likely to avoid getting it. So, conclusion is, the reason why experts say genetics cannot be used to predict the risks of suffering from hemochromatosis is simply because the medics are usually looking at a single gene, which is the wrong thing to do. The medical tests can never predict the risks of hemochromatosis, in that they're right, but the commercial DNA tests from Ancestry or 23andMe can. This latter thing is not yet accepted by the experts, and the reason why that is that CheckIron is the only group looking at the problem the way we are, using lots of data. Even the scientists who are looking at multiple genes never look at enough data to see the effects of what is truly going on in the iron metabolism. Our other major conclusion is that carriers can and do load, and again, by looking at all the relevant genes and mutations, we can predict if a carrier is going to overload iron. We call these mutations from the other genes the loading speed modifiers. The effect of the modifiers is identical, independent of what the HFE mutations actually are in that person. This means the modifiers have the biggest effect for carriers. Note, there are many more carriers than there are those with 2 mutations of the HFE gene. The doctors believe that just the HFE gene is involved, and because of that, they generally think carriers do not overload. It is true the modifiers have bigger effect, but our findings are it's the HFE single mutation plus the modifiers which causes the overloading. This mistake by the doctors and the hemochromatosis organisations has led to the number of hemochromatosis sufferers being totally underestimated. Now let's look at the numbers for both the US and the UK. First, the UK. Hemochromatosis UK believe the number of people suffering hemochromatosis in the UK is 380,000, but they don't explain how they got this number. We do know that they believe people with 2 mutations suffering hemochromatosis, and they think carriers do not. If we add up the numbers in the table, which are based on published prevalence and penetrance figures for 2 mutation people, we actually get 406,000 people in the UK, which is actually 7% more than the hemochromatosis UK figure. I think the reason why hemochromatosis UK don't explain where they get the numbers from is because if they did, everyone would realise they don't include the numbers for carriers. Now, if you are a carrier, you have 1 to 2% chance of getting iron overload. So you might think that this is not important. But the problem is 31.5% of the population are carriers. So now multiplying these numbers together results in a large number of carriers who suffer from iron overload. More than as those who suffer homozygous C282Y, the strongest form. These people are ignored by the hemochromatosis organisations simply because they don't understand how it can happen. Remember, they're only looking for 3 mutations of a single gene, whereas we at CheckIron believe they should be looking at something like 150 mutations of multiple genes. They have their eyes half shut and refuse to see what is staring them in the face. This is so prevalent for carriers that there are Facebook groups specifically for carriers, again ignored by the hemochromatosis organisations. In the US, the only figure I can find for number of sufferers is 1 million from hemochromatosis.org. From my data, again from published scientific papers giving me prevalence and penetrance, and using Wikipedia for white and Hispanic population breakdown, we include Hispanics for H63D as it's more prevalent in that group. I end up with 1.5 million sufferers for the 2 mutation people and 3 million sufferers when we include the carriers. Again, the hemochromatosis organisations in the US have the eyes half shut. They don't even have a reasonable estimate for non-carriers. But if you add carriers, their number is 3 times too small. Okay, let's summarise our findings. Number 1, no one else is taking the approach we are, using data to predict when someone will get symptoms. 2, the commercial tests from Ancestry and 23andMe are many times more informative than the medical tests, which look at just a few mutations from a small number of genes, often just the single HFE gene. 3, the doctors and the hemochromatosis organisations have their eyes half open on this problem. But if you read the scientific papers, this is not the case. Many doctors ignore carriers, and therefore the estimate of those affected is about 50% of the people who really are affected, 3 million in the US and 700,000 in the UK. The scientists do not suffer from this problem and often report on the effects of other genes as well, although in some cases they put too much emphasis on the very rare conditions and not enough on the common inflammatory conditions. 4. Hemochromatosis causes inflammation, but doctors correctly like to distinguish the cause of the inflammation because it's always the cause that should be treated or prevented. But what is not taken into account is the iron metabolism is intrinsically used by the immune system as part of the body's control of inflammation. When the body wants to increase inflammation to fight disease, it increases iron, and when it wants to decrease inflammation, it decreases iron. The symptoms of inflammation are those symptoms of hemochromatosis. So you cannot distinguish symptoms, you can only distinguish the causes. Inflammation symptoms such as diabetes, liver disease, heart disease, arthritis and Alzheimer's are all caused by both hemochromatosis and some other inflammatory condition, which we'll call something else. In the case of carriers, the something else is often more significant. But even for carriers, the single HFE gene is one of the causes. Yes, some people say for carriers are getting these symptoms only because of the something else's, but this is completely false. If that were true, carriers would have the same chance of loading iron as non-carriers, i.e. ordinary people. And this is absolutely not true in the scientific data. If you are a carrier, your chances of getting iron overload are between 71% and 186% more than someone with no HFE mutations. And I think that those numbers are significant. 5. The hemochromatosis type 2 and type 4 mutations are actually rare. the hemochromatosis type 3 mutation is not rare, and just like hemochromatosis type 1 is not rare, even though many people are lazy and call them all rare. The definition of rare is 1 in 10,000, and hemochromatosis is not rare. Also, we see a significant number of people with both types 1 and type 3. 6. The number of people at risk of iron overload due to hemochromatosis is double the number promoted by the hemochromatosis organisations in the US and the UK, due to them excluding the carriers from their numbers. And finally, 7. We can use DNA to predict when someone will get hemochromatosis from DNA alone, and this approach can be used by young people to prevent suffering from iron overload. Okay, so that's the summary. Now let's just finish off. Thanks again for the nearly 300 people who have uploaded their data. This is your data and these are your results, and they are helping in our understanding of hemochromatosis. And we're moving forwards, but it's important to realise that even 300 data sets is still not enough to prove scientifically everything we've seen. So keep using us and tell your friends about CheckIron.com. We do need people without hemochromatosis to upload their data too, because we need to check that for carriers at least, we are not predicting illness for people who are not going to suffer. Currently, nearly everyone who uploads their data is an actual hemochromatosis sufferer. Thanks again. Please like and subscribe to this video and look forward to passing on more information in the next video. Bye.